Hello, I'm Ginny Stibolt. I'm a botanist, a native plant enthusiast, and an author for the University Press of Florida. I'm very pleased to be an author, and I've never written a book before I started writing for University Press of Florida. And what is so impressive about the books at University Press is that they are peer-reviewed books, which adds more time to the development, but it makes it a better product in the end because you have experts who weigh in on whether the book is a good idea and whether there are mistakes in it. So,
I'm Stephanie Hunter. I'm the acquiring editor for gardening at the University Press of Florida. And we're very excited about Jenny's new book, Adventures of a Transplanted Gardener, which is just coming out. And I had some questions. It's been a really fun process to work on this book. Why did you write this book?
Well, I wrote this because I'm sure I'm not the first person who's been flummoxed by Florida gardening. I thought I knew what I was doing. I had a master's degree in botany, and I figured I knew how to grow things, but I made mistakes. And so I began writing columns for the Jacksonville newspaper called Adventures of a Transplanted Gardener with all my mistakes and what I did. And as a community columnist, that program lasted for about 3 years. And when I first met the acquiring editor for University Press of Florida at a conference, I said, well, maybe you could repost, we could do a compilation of Adventures of Transplanted Gardener articles. And he said, well, unless you're Carl Hyacin, we don't do that. So
that was several years ago.
Yeah, that was back in 2008.
Mm-hmm.
And so he said, could you write an organic gardening book for Florida? And I've written now 4 other books, but I came back to this because there are so many people, I think, who need help, and this is like in the first person instead of more like a textbook like my other books. So it's like advice from an old friend.
Yeah, it's like we're gardening alongside you, I think. It's much more personal and narrative.
It is. And, it was fun to write. Of course, we've had the pandemic, so I wasn't traveling or anything like that, so I had time to do that. But it's color throughout. I talk about vegetable gardening, I talk about native gardening, I talk about as a long introduction to Florida, and one of the peer reviewers, well, actually both of the peer reviewers for this book thought the introduction to Florida should be longer. So I was happy to expand that chapter so that we start with a drive in Pensacola to Key West, and what you would find on your way down to that. So this is a new book. And it really isn't the old columns. I talk about the old columns, but it's with an update, a 2020 hindsight in the year 2020, of what has happened since I wrote those columns so long ago.
And so we're thinking so many of these readers are going to be people who are not familiar with Florida, moving from out of state,
right,
and make these common gardening mistakes. And so you give us several examples of mistakes that you've made in here.
Oh, yes.
I thought maybe you could share one with us.
Well, the most famous one is the tulip mistake, where I bought 64 tulip bulbs from a local store, and I planted them in various places in my yard, thinking I could recreate spring like I had up in Maryland, where I was from. And the next spring, I got 1 leaf, no blooms.
Out of 64 bulbs.
Out of 64 bulbs, no matter where I planted them, they failed. And so I was talking to a neighbor, and she says, oh, everyone here knows that you have to put them in the refrigerator to simulate winter. But there were no instructions on the package saying that. So it made me angry that they were selling something that was guaranteed to fail. And that's what got me started writing. Even though I wasn't a writer before, that's what started that.
And so you say that you're a native plant enthusiast.
Yes.
What is a native plant and what's an invasive plant? How would you define that?
Okay, so the Native Plant Society of Florida, I joined that in 2006. And so that went from what could I grow in Florida, not tulips, to what belongs here in Florida, And so then I started nativizing, I know it's not a word, nativizing my yard with more native plants. Now there are invasive plants, and I talk about that in a number of books, particularly The Art of Maintaining a Florida Native Landscape, where I talk about invasive plants, where these are plants that are not native, but have moved into natural areas in Florida. And there are some specific examples that are just tremendous problems, like the what's called the Florida holly, which is a Brazilian pepper bush, which was planted on purpose, but now it is taken over. It's in the poison ivy family. And then there's the mimosa tree that is invasive. And then there is the Mexican petunias, and many of these are still being sold. So I did talk about it in this. And I wrote the the art of maintaining a Florida native landscape, because many native plant enthusiasts sort of overpromise how easy native plants are going to be.
Okay.
Oh, just plant them, they'll be fine because they belong here. So I wanted to talk about how you plant something so that it's more likely to survive.
Yeah.
And how do you design your landscape so that you don't have a lot of maintenance, ongoing maintenance. And so hopefully we would have people planting fewer seasonal plantings. That's what's offered in our big box stores and other gardening things, petunias and marigolds and other things that are in full bloom, and you have to plant them every 3 months because they die, because they're sold when they're blooming. And so as far as the plant is concerned, it's at the end of the life cycle. And many of those beautiful flowering plants that are relatively inexpensive have been treated with insecticides, systemic insecticides, and that kills your butterflies. So that's the last kind of plant that you want in your landscape if you want pollinators. So there's a lot to think about, but you want native plants.
What are some examples of native plants? Maybe some that you would recommend for new gardeners?
Wow, there's so many. It's really, I can't even think of ones, but you have black-eyed Susans, you've got sunshine mimosa, which is a ground cover, so it's not the mimosa tree, but it's a ground cover with little pink flowers like Dr. Seuss flowers. And so you would end up with a good ground cover. There's the native sable palm, which is our state tree. It's a native. So we want to do more natives to better support the pollinators, better support the birds, and we want non-poison landscapes.
I want to ask about the sable palm, because we have this new book,
the
Palmetto book.
Yes.
And it's not often that you find an entire book on one plant.
One plant. Yes. Now, Jono Miller wrote this book. This is very interesting, and he's done some presentations on it as well. And there are just a wide array of interesting stories that he tells in this book about the sable palm. And it is the state tree, but botanically, palms are not trees. They don't produce wood, and so we have to maybe question our state, saying that this is our this is our state tree, when it's really more like a grass.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. Is it a tree? Is it a grass?
No, because it doesn't produce wood. It's not technically a tree.
Okay.
But Jono Miller has some really cool stories.
Yeah.
And it is unusual to have a whole book on one plant.
But it's very interesting. I learned quite a bit about the palmetto palm, or the palmetto tree.
Right.
Tree.
Right. So the other book that was fairly recent, again, this was a follow-up to this book. So this book is The Art of Maintaining a Florida Native Landscape. The step-by-step to a Florida native yard answers a question that was asked of Doug Tallamy, who is the guru of native plant people. He changed the whole narrative on native plants because he's an entomologist, and he talks about, well, you have to have bugs. and caterpillars, and you're only going to get those on native plants. So he talked about how a pair of chickadees needs 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise one clutch of young. And so you're not going to get them on the non-native trees. So Marjorie, my co-author and also my illustrator, she's a terrific illustrator, went to one of Doug Tallamy's lectures back several years ago, and a woman stood up and she said, so I have a small yard in Florida and it has no natives. How do I get started? Of course, Doug Tallamy is from Delaware, not Florida, and he's an entomologist and not a landscape architect, so he didn't have an answer. This is the answer to that woman's question. So what we did is we took a tour of a third of an acre lot in Florida, and how do you get it to be more native? And what I like about this book is that there are illustrations on how to get into your yard and how do you set up a plan. So we do it step by step, which is why it's in the name.
Right.
And we end up, in the end product is on the cover of a landscape with rain gardens, a landscape with the Freedom Lawn, a landscape with permeable pavers, but you still have place for vegetables, you still have a place for activities.
So you were talking about native plants and the importance of native plants for pollinators. So maybe I thought we could talk a little bit about pollinators, about wildlife in the garden.
Right. Now, people want birds in their yard, and birds ends up being the charismatic wildlife.
Okay.
Because if you say wildlife, people don't necessarily have a good impression of what wildlife would be. And so there are a number of books here that talk about what plants are good for Florida wildlife. So this is Craig Kugel's book. Craig's a wonderful author, a good friend, and a botanist. And so this is more of a plant book, where my books are more about how to be successful with plants. This is more on the plants itself.
Maybe what plants you should choose.
What plants you should choose for which wildlife and that kind of thing. And he also has one for shade.
Yeah.
And people always ask that question. So I have a lot of shade, which is really good. You want shade because your yard is cooler and stuff like that. But what plants are good in shade? And so again, this is a plant-based book about the plants themselves and what their characteristics are. So Craig has done some really interesting books, and I love this one. This is its most recent one, is The Nature of Plants. Now, he's a good botanist, and I did a review of it I wasn't a peer reviewer, but I did a review of it for the Native Plant Society journal. And what I said was that as a botanist, I didn't think I'd have a lot to learn in this book. I figured I would already know quite a bit, and I did. But he's personalized it, and he's talked about other things about how the plants are put together. And again, it's a peer-reviewed book, and I know he had to do a little bit of rewriting of the book as part of the process. And while as an author that is frustrating, it's very frustrating to have to rewrite your book. But again, the end product is better. And people can trust the information because it's in there.
And one of the great things about this book, I think, is that it's approachable. He's a botanist, but he's writing in a very approachable way.
Right, yeah. This is his reaction to botany, basically.
Yeah.
Now, the other kinds of books on pollinators are the butterfly books, that you guys have a couple of butterfly books. But this is the newest one by Dr. Daniels. He's terrific. Oh, he's done so much really interesting work here in Maryland. And he's right here in Gainesville. But yeah, it's a butterfly book. And the butterflies are, again, charismatic, that you want them in your yard. And so he goes through and talks about which are which. But when you're doing butterfly gardening, you need more than just something for the adult butterflies that will do the pollination.
You have to think about the whole life cycle.
Yes, you have to think about the caterpillars. So if you want monarch butterflies, and this is the most famous example, if you want monarch butterflies, which is what's on the cover here, you need to plant milkweed. And you need to plant the native milkweed. And Florida has 41 species of native milkweed, but only 4 or 5 are in the native plant trade. So the one that I like best is a swamp milkweed, Asclepias perennis, because it grows more easily than some of the others that are quite fussy about where they're planted.
I'm glad you mentioned the monarch butterfly, because something I learned from this book, like I'm very familiar with the monarch butterfly. You know, as a child, you see them on the playground. But I didn't realize that they're possibly endangered now, that there are scientists lobbying to get them put on the endangered species list.
Right, and much of that is due to, well, we're going to get controversial here. Well, much of it is due to the Roundup Ready crops. So farmers are spraying Roundup on their croplands, which is killing the milkweed that used to
for the caterpillars.
be a weed, and now it's not there anymore.
So what can individual gardeners do to help support
plant native milkweed? And really, we need to have pollinator gardens that's unpoisoned, because what was there before is not there. But monarchs also migrate, which is different than most butterflies. So they move from the north, and they spend the winter, down in Mexico, most of them, near Mexico City. So it takes 4 life cycles to get down there.
Oh, wow, I didn't realize that.
And then they survive the winter, so that's the longest lived one, is the one in Mexico. And then they come back up again. And so it's really fascinating. I think that's what makes them so attractive to people. But it's easy to support them.
What butterflies do you see most in your yard?
I do see monarchs, but I have passiflora, which is the passion flower. So I also see the zebra longwing, which is our state butterfly, and also the Gulf fritillaries, and that's probably the most common that I have. But again, I have the larval food for both of those caterpillars. So the passion vine that grows in the shade is more attractive to the zebra longwing butterflies, and the passion flower that grows in the sun is more attractive to the Gulf fritillary butterflies. So, but I also wanted to, if people are interested in native plants, this is my favorite topic, my favorite handbook, written by Gil Nelson in conjunction with the Florida Association of Native Plants. So these are 200 native plants for your landscape that are readily available. So there are a lot of native plants, but not all of them are in the native landscape trade. And what he does in here, and this is for homeowners and professionals, what he does is he's got drawings, he's got photographs, he's got how big they're going to be, what you should plant them with, how do you what are their best features, what are their problems, what are they closest related to, and I love, again, that there's both a drawing and photographs, because I think that you can see stuff in a drawing that you might not notice in a photograph, because the drawing can emphasize whether it's hairy or other things like that. But this is because it's with the Florida Association of Native Nurseries, this is very handy, and this is the one that is going to help you the most if you're just beginning with native plants. And Gil Nelson has written a number of other books as well, which we don't have here, but it's been interesting.
And we also have a book that's maybe geared more towards researchers and professionals who are looking for a reference book on plants in Florida.
Right, and this was heavy. So most of the plant-oriented books, like the plants for shady lands. It's just a selection. So the Wonderland and Hansen book is all of the plants. And there are no pictures in here. So what you can do is find what the features are and compare what the features are so that you can identify what plants you have. So this is all of the Florida plants.
A compendium of research.
It really
book.
is, and it includes the invasives.
Okay.
So it's not just native plants,
Yeah.
it's all the plants.
Okay.
So this is a heavy volume. And again, without pictures, it's not for the casual observer. Right. This is if you really want to know what you have.
Yeah.
So you have St. John's wort, which is it? You know,
yeah.
There's a number of different species.
You were talking about pesticides, and so I wanted to ask a little bit more about that. What is an eco-friendly way to deal with weeds? If you have weeds in your yard, what would you recommend for someone who doesn't want to use pesticides?
Okay, so if we're talking about lawns, which is where most of the pesticides are applied by lawn service companies, they spray for weeds with 2,4-D. They spray for insects. They spray for funguses. They spray for other pests, so-called pests, insecticides, they have insecticides. And then that sort of reduces the viability of the soil underneath there because they put all this stuff in the soil. So then they need to, the lawn services need to put synthetic fertilizer so the grass will grow. So the grass ends up being on total life support for these chemicals. And the soil becomes just a holding medium for the roots, which get shorter and shorter because they're over-irrigated. And all this stuff washes into our waterways. And when it does, then we end up with green algae because there's too many fertilizers in there, and we end up with poisons in our landscapes. So one of the ways that you can sequester more of your water is to build rain gardens and have rain barrels. So it's a two-pronged approach to keep more water on your own landscape, because anything that goes into the storm drains will end up in a nearby waterway. We all live in a watershed. So my Sustainable Gardening for Florida book was my first book. And this is what I wrote when the editor, John, asked me to write an organic gardening book. I wrote this book instead. I did a 20-page proposal saying, no, sustainable is much more interesting than organic gardening. It's much more important than organic gardening because we need to save water, we need to plant a tree correctly. So this is a 14 chapters of how to survive Florida gardening. So this was my first book, how to do hurricane-scaping, how to do fire-wise landscaping, how to plant a tree. And I talk in here about growing more of your own food, which brings me to another book. So this was the second book. So this is the book that John really wanted. All right, and this I wrote with Melissa Contreras, now Melissa Markham, and she's in Miami. And so I'm a botanist and a hobby gardener. She was working at an organic farm. She was setting up farmers markets, and her information and her education was all different than mine. So what we talk about in here, and she's also in South Florida, so there's a different set of crops. And her husband was from Honduras, so we had more Latino crops and other things that I had never heard of. So it was really a good compilation. Now, most vegetable books are arranged by the alphabet, not this one. As a botanist, I said, no, we need to arrange it by plant family because the crop rotation is done by plant family. And as a writer, it was much more efficient to talk about a whole family. Like the legumes produce their own nitrogen due to a symbiotic relationship with bacteria in the soil. So you don't want to over-fertilize and put too many nutrients in with your beans and peas and stuff, because that means that they'll get more foliage but fewer fruits.
Okay.
So I only had to explain that once
Right.
for the whole family. If it had been alphabetical, I would have had to explain it once for the beans, once for the peas, once for the chickpeas. And so now, because it's by family, then it makes it much more efficient.
Mm-hmm.
And it's part of the education to talk about what families things are in. Because people may not know that cucumber is a squash, in the squash family.
Yeah.
So this was fun to write, and we talk about, again, no poisons. But for my book that I didn't write for this press, I did research on why growing food is good for the planet. It's because of for every pound of food that you grow, it offsets up to 2 pounds of greenhouse gas emissions. Wow. And so growing your own food is very good for the planet. And again, I think this book has sold very well during the pandemic because people are growing more food because the food is expensive and stuff. But most of the reason that it offsets greenhouse gases is because of transportation, mostly refrigerated, food waste for commercial operations, where if it's not perfect, it's not there. And fresh food is better for you.
Yeah.
So,
While we're talking about food, I wanted to point out Florida's edible wild plants, because Florida native plants, some of them are edible.
Right. So Peggy Lance is a terrific woman. I like her a lot. And she wrote this really cool little book about recipes for fixing acorn bread and other kinds of things that you can grow and cook with native plants. We have a couple of native plant crops in the Organic Methods book, but most of them would not be crops. They'd be weeds, like Florida betony. You can eat the roots of Florida betony. They're sort of like a radish. But she talks about a lot more of that and how do you fix them. So this is a really interesting little book that will help you do a little bit of foraging in your own yard.
So you're talking about rain barrels and water, the importance of thinking about our water. And that's something I really appreciated in Adventures of a Transplanted Gardener, is that you explain rain barrels and how to set them up.
Right.
And you also go into, you have a whole chapter on compost, if I remember. You have a large section on compost.
Right.
And so you're talking about the soil and losing nutrients, stripping the soil. Could you maybe explain composting and how to get started?
Right, and I just posted something on my Facebook yesterday on May 4th with Yoda saying, "Save the planet, you wish, compost you must."
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
So what the composting is, there's several ways to compost. So you can have a pile, you can have a tumbler, or you can do, one of my favorites is to take your kitchen scraps and use trench composting. So when I'm preparing a bed for something to be planted, I'll take all the kitchen scraps, bury them into
the plant,
into
itself.
the bed.
Okay.
And if they're already planted, like just planted, I plant them in between the rows and stuff like that. So by the time the roots get down there, it's already decomposed. Yeah, but composting is actually a fermentation process. So when you have the right ratio of green and brown in the compost, you'll see it steaming. So here are my 5 books from the University Press of Florida. I'm very proud of them. And while my first book was Sustainable Gardening for Florida, all of these books cover how to be more sustainable. And it is a responsibility to, I think in my part, to help people be more efficient in their gardening and to help preserve our only planet. because it's the only one we have. So thank you very much for being the host for this. And again, it's been my pleasure.
And all of Jenny's books and all of these other gardening books are available on our website at upress.ufl.edu.